When Texas Senator Ted Cruz invited former Daily Show host Jon Stewart on his podcast, his advisors freaked out. "This is suicide," they said. "He's going to rip you apart on live TV." Cruz just smiled. Maybe this is exactly what America needs to see. 2 hours later, social media would be ablaze, applauding a hero no one expected. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The studio. Lights were dimmed in the Austin recording facility where the Cruz Perspective podcast was filmed. It was a modest setup, deliberately so. Unlike the glossy television studios Cruz had grown accustomed to, this space featured exposed brick walls, vintage microphones, and the kind of intimate atmosphere that had helped political podcasts eclipse traditional media in recent years. Cruz sat alone, reviewing his notes for the third time. His producer, Kevin Martinez, hovered anxiously nearby. "Senator, I still think this is a mistake," Martinez said, checking his watch. "Stewart's built his entire career destroying conservatives on camera. Remember what he did to Tucker last year?" Cruz looked up, a faint smile crossing his face. "I remember. That's partly why I invited him. But why on your own platform? Why give him this kind of—" "Because," Cruz interrupted, "someone has to break this cycle. All we do is scream at each other from our separate corners. Blue shows for blue viewers, red shows for red viewers. Maybe it's time someone tried something different." Martinez wasn't convinced. "The base won't like it. They're already flooding the comments section with concerns." "Then they can unsubscribe," Cruz replied, his tone matter of fact. "I'm not doing this for likes or subscribers." Before Martinez could respond, the studio door opened. Jon Stewart entered, dressed casually in jeans and a dark button-down shirt. At 62, his hair had turned completely gray, but he carried himself with the same energetic presence that had made him a television icon. "Senator Cruz." Stewart extended his hand. "Thanks for the invitation. I have to admit, I was surprised." Cruz stood, shaking Stewart's hand firmly. "Surprised enough to accept." "Curiosity got the better of me." Stewart grinned. "That and the chance to see if your podcast studio is secretly decorated with Zodiac Killer memorabilia." Cruz laughed. Genuinely, not the performative chuckle politicians often deploy. "Sorry to disappoint. We keep that in the basement." The easy exchange seemed to momentarily disarm Stewart. He'd come prepared for immediate tension, not self-deprecating humor. As they took their seats and technicians fitted them with microphones, Stewart surveyed the room. "Nice setup. Very Joe Rogan meets NPR." "We're trying something different," Cruz replied. "Less polished, more conversation." "Well," Stewart adjusted his microphone. "Let's see how that works out." At precisely 2 p.m., the red recording light illuminated. Cruz launched into his standard introduction, welcoming listeners to episode 127 of the Cruz Perspective. Today's guest needs no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. He's hosted The Daily Show, testified before Congress on behalf of 9/11 first responders, won 22 Emmy Awards, and spent nearly 2 decades being a thorn in the side of politicians from both parties. Though, let's be honest, mainly Republicans. Cruz smiled. "Please welcome Jon Stewart." "Thank you, Senator," Stewart began. "Though I should correct the record, it was 24 Emmys. I'm sure that was just an innocent mistake and not an attempt to diminish my achievements." The joke carried an edge, setting the tone for what was to come. The first 15 minutes progressed cordially enough. They discussed Stewart's career transition, his advocacy work, and the changing landscape of political media. Cruz was well prepared, asking thoughtful questions and listening attentively to Stewart's responses. But the conversation shifted when Cruz mentioned the growing political division in America. "Don't you think," Stewart said, leaning forward, "that politicians who deliberately inflame tensions for political gain bear some responsibility for that division?" "Absolutely," Cruz nodded. "On both sides?" "Both sides," Stewart repeated, a familiar sarcastic edge entering his voice. "Let's talk about that famous both sides argument. In 2016, you called Donald Trump a pathological liar, utterly amoral, and a narcissist at a level I don't think this country's ever seen. Then you became one of his most loyal supporters. How does that work exactly? The trap had been sprung. Stewart wasn't there for a friendly conversation. He had come armed with research, quotes, and a clear agenda. Cruz took a sip of water. That's a fair question, Jon. During the primary— I'm not finished, Stewart interrupted. You've built a career on constitutional principles, yet when the 2020 election results came in, you supported efforts to overturn the outcome based on claims that multiple courts rejected. You read Dr. Seuss on the Senate floor to delay climate legislation. You fled to Cancun during a Texas power crisis. Stewart was now in full attack mode, his voice rising with each accusation. So my question is this: is there any principle you wouldn't abandon for political expedience? The studio fell silent. Martinez, watching from behind the glass, closed his eyes, imagining the viral clips that would be circulating within hours. Another Republican eviscerated by Jon Stewart. But Cruz didn't become defensive. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this all along. You know, Jon, he said finally, I had a feeling we might end up here. Where exactly is here? Stewart asked. The place where we stop having a conversation and start performing for our respective audiences. Cruz's tone remained measured. You came armed with a list of my perceived hypocrisies, ready to create a viral moment. That's fine. It's what the public has come to expect from political discourse. But I invited you here today, hoping we might try something different, Stewart smirked. Something different, like answering the question? I'll answer everything you asked, Cruz replied. But first, can I ask you something? When you accepted this invitation, did you come hoping to understand a perspective different from your own, or did you come to score points? Stewart's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. I came to hold power accountable. That's what I've always done. And that's admirable, Cruz nodded. But accountability requires understanding, not just confrontation. I've made mistakes, Jon. I've taken positions I later regretted. I've sometimes put political calculations above my better judgment. If that's the admission you came for, there it is. Stewart seemed momentarily taken aback by Cruz's candor. But here's what troubles me, Cruz continued. We've created a political culture where changing one's mind is seen as weakness, where admitting error is considered fatal, and where every inconsistency is evidence of moral bankruptcy rather than human complexity. Cruz leaned forward, his voice remaining calm but gaining intensity. You asked about Trump. Yes, we had a bitter primary. Yes, I said harsh things, and so did he. Then we found common ground on policies that matter to my constituents: tax reform, border security, judicial appointments. That's not hypocrisy. Jon, that's governance. So principles are negotiable when convenient? Stewart pressed. No, but governance requires collaboration, even with people you've disagreed with. When my daughter was diagnosed with asthma last year, I co-sponsored clean air legislation with Bernie Sanders, someone I disagree with on almost everything else. Should I have refused because we'd criticized each other in the past? For the first time, Stewart seemed to hesitate. The conversation wasn't following the familiar script. This wasn't the defensive, easily flustered Cruz he had anticipated. Cruz continued. You mentioned Cancun, a mistake I've acknowledged repeatedly. During a crisis, I should have stayed in Texas, full stop. But does that error define my entire career? Does it negate the work I've done on criminal justice reform, human trafficking legislation, or disaster relief? Stewart shifted strategy. Let's talk about January 6th then. I supported a constitutional process to review electoral concerns, Cruz interjected. I never supported violence or insurrection. When it became clear that courts had thoroughly reviewed and rejected the claims, I voted to certify the results. That's how the system is supposed to work. Stewart wasn't backing down, but you helped create the environment where those falsehoods flourished. You gave oxygen to conspiracy theories. Perhaps I did, Cruz acknowledged, surprising Stewart again, and I've reflected on that. But Jon, here's what I'm trying to get at. We've created a political culture where the only acceptable position is total warfare, where compromise is weakness, where the other side isn't just wrong, but evil. Cruz paused, looking directly at Stewart. And media figures like yourself, with all due respect, have helped create that culture. When was the last time you invited someone you disagree with into a conversation with the goal of understanding rather than demolishing them? The question hung in the air, and for the first time in the conversation, Jon Stewart appeared genuinely thoughtful rather than tactical. That's a fair point, he finally conceded, though I would argue that power deserves scrutiny, not deference. I agree completely. Cruz nodded. But scrutiny isn't the same as automatic demonization. You came here today with a folder full of gotcha moments, not seeking to understand why a Princeton-educated constitutional lawyer might hold positions different from yours. What happened next would transform what had begun as a standard political confrontation into something entirely unexpected. Stewart leaned back in his chair, studying Cruz with renewed interest. The conversation had veered far from the anticipated script, and he was recalibrating in real time. Okay, Senator, he said, his tone less combative. Let's try it your way. Help me understand your perspective on climate change. You've called it pseudo-scientific theory, yet you represent a state that's experiencing increasingly devastating weather events. Where's the disconnect? Cruz nodded appreciatively at the shift in tone. That's a complex question that deserves more than a soundbite. My position has evolved as the science has developed. I don't deny climate change is occurring. What I question is the proposed solutions and their economic impact. He reached for a folder beside him. I brought some data I thought might come up today. Texas leads the nation in renewable energy production, particularly wind power. We've reduced carbon emissions while growing our economy. My concern isn't with environmental goals, but with approaches that would devastate energy jobs without meaningful global impact when countries like China continue increasing emissions. Stewart appeared genuinely surprised. That's more nuanced than your public statements suggest. Because nuance doesn't fit in a tweet or a 5-second news clip, Cruz replied. And that's part of the problem we're facing as a country. We've reduced complex policy debates to tribal warfare. The conversation continued for another hour, covering immigration, healthcare, and gun legislation. With each topic, the pattern repeated. Stewart would begin with a sharp critique. Cruz would acknowledge legitimate concerns before offering context and counterpoints, and gradually, a genuine dialogue emerged. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. What had begun as an attempted takedown was evolving into something rarely seen in American political discourse, a respectful exchange between ideological opponents. When the discussion turned to poverty and economic inequality, Cruz shared something unexpected. My father came to America with nothing, washing dishes for 50 cents an hour, he said, his voice softening. I've never forgotten that background. Where I differ from my Democratic colleagues isn't in wanting to help people struggling, it's in which approaches actually work. He described visiting homeless shelters in Houston, meeting with single mothers in San Antonio, and working with community leaders in underserved areas. These experiences inform my policies more than party doctrine ever could. Stewart, now fully engaged in the conversation rather than the confrontation, leaned forward. But how do you reconcile that personal concern with voting against minimum wage increases or expanded health care access? Because I've seen the unintended consequences of well-intentioned policies, Cruz explained. After the minimum wage increased in Seattle, low-income workers saw their hours cut and total earnings decrease. That doesn't mean we do nothing, but it means we need to be honest about results, not just intentions. He outlined his support for opportunity zones, vocational training programs, and criminal justice reforms designed to break cycles of poverty. There are conservative approaches to addressing inequality that don't get much media attention because they don't fit the narrative. For the first time, Stewart seemed genuinely thoughtful rather than tactical. I'll concede that the left doesn't always acknowledge when our preferred policies fail to deliver the promised results. And the right doesn't always communicate our underlying concerns effectively, Cruz responded. We end up talking past each other instead of finding common ground. As the 2-hour mark approached, Martinez signaled from the control room that they needed to wrap up. Cruz nodded and turned to Stewart. Before we finish, Jon, I'd like to ask you something that's been on my mind. In all your years holding politicians accountable, what's the most important thing you've learned about governance that the public might not understand? Stewart paused, clearly not expecting this question. That's actually a thoughtful question. He considered for a moment. I think it's that governing is infinitely harder than criticizing. I can identify problems all day long. It's what I built a career on. But creating solutions that work in a diverse democracy of 330 million people, that's exponentially more difficult. Cruz nodded. That might be the most honest thing I've heard a media figure say about politics. Don't get used to it, Stewart quipped, a hint of his trademark humor returning. As they wrapped up the podcast, the tension that had marked the early exchange had transformed into something unexpected. Mutual respect, if not agreement. When they removed their microphones, Stewart extended his hand. This wasn't what I expected, Senator. Cruz shook it firmly. Sometimes the unexpected conversations are the most valuable. Don't think this means I won't criticize your policies in the future, Stewart added. I'd be disappointed if you didn't, Cruz replied, but maybe with a better understanding of where I'm coming from. As Stewart left the studio, Martinez approached Cruz, bewilderment evident on his face. That was not how I thought this would go. Cruz gathered his notes. Honestly, me neither. So what happens now? Martinez asked. Now, we release it, unedited exactly as it happened. Martinez looked uncertain. But some of what you said about Trump, about policy compromises, the base might not like it. Maybe it's time we stopped making every decision based on what the base might like, Cruz replied. Maybe that's how we ended up in this mess in the first place. Within hours of the podcast's release, clips began circulating online, but not the kind anyone had anticipated. Instead of Jon Stewart destroys Ted Cruz headlines, the conversation was taking an unexpected turn. A clip of Cruz saying, "I've made mistakes. I've sometimes put political calculations above my better judgment," went viral first, with viewers from across the political spectrum expressing surprise at his candor. Then came the moment when Cruz challenged Stewart. When was the last time you invited someone you disagree with into a conversation with the goal of understanding, rather than demolishing them? Liberal commentators found themselves uncomfortably reflecting on this question. By evening, the full 2-hour conversation had been viewed over 500,000 times. Extraordinary numbers for a political podcast. The comment sections filled with something rarely seen in political content: thoughtful reflection. I've hated Cruz for years, but I actually heard him out this time. Still disagree with most of his policies, but he made some fair points. Stewart. Came for blood, but ended up having a real conversation. We need more of this. Never thought I'd say this, but Ted Cruz just showed us what political discourse could be. Cable news, caught off guard by the unexpected narrative, scrambled to respond. Conservative outlets that had prepared to defend Cruz from a liberal ambush instead found themselves discussing the substantive policy points he'd raised. Progressive channels that had anticipated celebrating Stewart's takedown were forced to acknowledge that Cruz had held his own, and in some moments, emerged as the more reasonable voice. On social media, a strange phenomenon was occurring. The tribal reactions remained. Hardcore partisans on both sides found ways to claim victory. But a significant middle ground was emerging, with many expressing fatigue with the constant political combat and appreciation for seeing something different. A Democratic strategist on CNN offered a reluctant assessment. I hate to say it, but Cruz came across as thoughtful and willing to engage. That's not the caricature we're used to. A prominent liberal podcast host tweeted, "Still disagree with Ted Cruz on almost everything, but that conversation with Stewart should be required." Viewing for how to discuss politics without demonizing opponents. By midnight, Cruz Stewart was trending nationwide, with a secondary hashtag gaining momentum. More of this. In his Washington apartment, Cruz received a text from an unexpected source, a Democratic colleague in the Senate. "Watched your podcast? We should talk. Maybe there's a path forward on that criminal justice bill after all." Cruz smiled. Perhaps something was shifting, ever so slightly, in America's political landscape, but the most significant development was yet to come. The morning after the podcast aired, Jon Stewart woke to find his phone flooded with notifications. The conversation with Cruz had sparked something unexpected, not the typical partisan cheering or outrage, but a more nuanced discussion about political discourse itself. Stewart scrolled through social media, reading comments from his longtime fans. Many expressed confusion or even disappointment that he hadn't destroyed Cruz as expected. Others praised the exchange while questioning their own assumptions. Been watching Stewart for 20 years and never seen him actually listen to a conservative like this. Made me wonder what else I've missed by staying in my bubble. Stewart's publicist called, excited about booking follow-up interviews to discuss the viral moment. Major networks wanted his take on the conversation. What went wrong? Was it a strategic retreat? A tactical failure? Nothing went wrong, Stewart told her, surprising himself with the realization. We had an actual conversation. Maybe that's what went right. In Texas, Cruz was experiencing a similar phenomenon. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues, constituents, and media outlets. The reactions defied the usual partisan patterns. Republicans who had feared he'd be embarrassed were expressing relief and admiration. Democrats who despised his politics were grudgingly acknowledging his approach. Most surprising were the messages from independents and politically disengaged citizens. Never cared much for politics, too much shouting, but I watched your whole conversation with Stewart. First time I've seen politicians talk like actual humans. Cruz's communications director compiled a briefing of media reactions, expecting to develop a strategy to control potential damage. Instead, she found herself documenting something remarkable, a genuine shift in how Cruz was being discussed across the political spectrum. Senator, she reported during their morning call, this is unlike anything I've seen in 15 years of political communications. People aren't just reacting to what you said, they're responding to how you said it. 3 days after the podcast aired, as viewership surpassed 3 million, Cruz received an unexpected invitation to appear on Stewart's own show. The proposal came with an unusual caveat. No pre-planned topics, no staff preparation, just a continuation of their conversation about America's political divide. Cruz's team was divided. Some saw it as a trap, a chance for Stewart to correct his mistake by delivering the takedown his audience expected. Others recognized a historic opportunity to build on the surprising momentum. What do you think? Cruz asked Martinez as they discussed the invitation. Honestly, I think it's a risk, Martinez replied. But then again, so was inviting him in the first place, and that worked out differently than anyone expected. Cruz considered this. Schedule it, but make one thing clear. I'm not coming as a Republican talking to a Democrat. I'm coming as someone who cares about this country talking to someone else who cares, even if we disagree about how to move forward. The announcement of the follow-up conversation sparked even greater interest. News outlets that typically ignored political podcasts devoted segments to analyzing the first exchange and speculating about the second. Universities organized listening sessions. High school government teachers assigned the conversation as required listening. On social media, something even more unusual happened. People began sharing their own stories of cross-political conversations with family members, colleagues, and neighbors they'd previously avoided discussing politics with. Watched Cruz Stewart, and then actually talked politics with my liberal brother for the first time in 6 years. We still disagree, but I remembered he's not a bad person. Called my Trump-supporting dad after seeing the podcast. First civil political conversation we've had since 2016. A week later, Cruz arrived at Stewart's studio in New York. Unlike their first meeting, there was no underlying tension, no strategic positioning. They greeted each other like acquaintances who had discovered unexpected common ground. Your mentions must be a disaster zone, Stewart joked as they settled into their seats. Let's just say I've disappointed extremists on both sides, Cruz replied with a wry smile. Welcome to my world. Their second conversation, broadcast live, expanded beyond politics to examine the forces driving America's division. Media incentives that reward outrage, social media algorithms that reinforce existing beliefs, and economic pressures that turn uncertainty into anger. We've created a system where being reasonable is punished, Cruz observed. Politicians who compromise get primaried. Media figures who acknowledge complexity lose ratings. Citizens who express nuance get attacked from both sides. Stewart nodded. And those of us in media, myself included, have contributed to that. It's easier to mock than understand. More satisfying to demolish than build. The conversation wasn't without disagreement. They clashed on healthcare policy, environmental, regulations, and the role of government. But the nature of the disagreement had transformed. Each genuinely listened before responding, acknowledged valid points from the other side, and focused on ideas rather than attacks. Viewers witnessed something many had forgotten was possible. Two people with fundamentally different political philosophies engaging in good faith, finding areas of agreement while respecting areas of difference. As their conversation concluded, Stewart asked the question that had been building throughout their exchange. Where do we go from here? How do we scale this kind of conversation to a national level? Cruz considered this thoughtfully. I don't think it can be manufactured or forced, but it can be modeled. By leaders willing to disappoint their own side sometimes. By media figures brave enough to challenge their audience's assumptions, not just confirm them. By citizens willing to listen before judging. Stewart nodded. It's harder work than outrage. Much harder, Cruz agreed. But maybe that's the work our country needs right now. In the weeks that followed, the impact of these conversations expanded beyond politics into the broader culture. News programs experimented with new formats designed to promote understanding, rather than conflict. Universities reported renewed interest in debate and discourse programs. A bipartisan group of senators announced a series of town halls explicitly modeled on the Cruz-Stewart approach. Perhaps most significantly, a small but measurable shift appeared in public polling. When asked, "Do you believe most people who disagree with you politically are bad people, or simply have different views?" The percentage choosing bad people declined for the first time in a decade. 3 months after their initial podcast, Cruz and Stewart appeared together at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government for a discussion on rebuilding democratic discourse. The auditorium was packed with students, faculty, and political leaders from across the spectrum. During the Q&A session, a student asked Cruz what had motivated him to invite Stewart onto his podcast, knowing the potential for embarrassment or conflict. Cruz thought for a moment before responding. "I was tired," he said finally. "Tired of the performance of politics. Tired of knowing exactly what I was supposed to say to please my base. Tired of seeing fellow Americans as enemies rather than neighbors with different views." He glanced at Stewart. "I took a risk because sometimes leadership means going first, reaching across divides, being willing to be uncomfortable. And what I discovered was that beneath our political identities, there's still enough common ground to build upon." Stewart nodded in agreement. "I came to that podcast armed for battle. I had my research, my gotcha moments, my righteous indignation all prepared. But somewhere in that conversation, I remembered something I'd forgotten, that understanding should precede judgment, not the other way around." As they concluded their remarks, a political science professor asked the question many had been pondering. "Do you think this moment will last, or are we witnessing a temporary aberration in our political discourse?" Cruz and Stewart exchanged glances, neither rushing to answer. "I don't know," Cruz admitted finally. "Human nature gravitates toward tribalism and conflict. Our media systems reward outrage. Our political structures incentivize division. We're pushing against powerful currents. But," Stewart added, "history isn't deterministic. Cultural change often begins with small shifts that gather momentum, with individual choices that inspire others." Cruz nodded. "The easiest prediction is cynicism, that nothing will change, that we'll return to our corners and resume the fight. The harder path is to believe that enough Americans are tired of the division, hungry for something better, willing to do the difficult work of citizenship in a diverse democracy." As the event concluded, an unexpected moment captured the essence of their unlikely alliance. A student approached with a photo request, and as Cruz and Stewart stood together, neither smiling nor frowning but simply present, a photographer called out, "Can you pretend to argue for the picture? That would be more interesting." Cruz and Stewart exchanged glances, then both shook their heads. "Actually," Cruz replied, "I think we've all had enough of pretending." The story of Jon Stewart's attempt to humiliate Ted Cruz, and Cruz's surprising response that transformed him into an unlikely hero, wasn't just about two political figures finding common ground. It was about a nation rediscovering the possibility of disagreement without demonization, of complexity without compromise of core values. In a political landscape often defined by its extremes, their conversation offered a glimpse of a different path, one requiring more effort, more discomfort, and more courage than the familiar patterns of outrage and division. As one commentator observed, the Cruz-Stewart moment didn't solve America's political problems. It didn't bridge our ideological divides or resolve our policy disagreements. What it did was far more basic and perhaps more important. It reminded us that behind every political label is a human being, with reasons for their beliefs that deserve to be understood before they're dismissed. In the months that followed, Cruz would continue his Senate work with a subtle but significant shift in approach, more willing to explain his reasoning, to acknowledge complexity, to disappoint partisan expectations when principles required it. His approval ratings initially dropped among hardcore Republicans, but rose among independents and moderate Democrats, a trade many political consultants would have advised against. Stewart, too, evolved in his approach. While he didn't abandon his progressive principles or his sharp critique of power, his commentary became more nuanced, more willing to acknowledge the humanity and occasional wisdom of those he disagreed with. Neither man fundamentally changed their political beliefs. What changed was their willingness to see beyond those beliefs to the person holding them, and in doing so, to model what democratic citizenship at its best might look like. The story of Jon Stewart and Ted Cruz reflects the deeper yearning in American society today for discourse that transcends tribal lines and recognizes our shared humanity. In a time when political differences have become nearly religious in their intensity, their unexpected exchange demonstrated that the path forward isn't through defeating opponents, but understanding them. This doesn't mean abandoning principles or ignoring genuine disagreements. Rather, it suggests that effective democracy requires seeing political opponents as fellow citizens rather than enemies, and recognizing that different perspectives often emerge from valid, if different, concerns about America's future. The lesson for Americans in 2025 is clear. Breaking the cycle of political hostility begins with individual choices to listen before judging, to seek understanding before critique, and to remember that beneath our political identities lies our shared identity as Americans facing common challenges, even if we differ on the solutions. As Cruz himself noted in their final exchange, the hardest patriotism isn't fighting those we disagree with. It's finding the courage to listen to them. Thank you for watching this story about finding common ground in divided times. Don't forget to subscribe and comment below with your thoughts. We'll see you in the next video.